June 1812. The largest army ever assembled in European history crosses into Russia. Over 600,000 men from across Napoleon's empire, equipped with the finest weapons, led by battle-hardened generals, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces and thousands of supply wagons. Napoleon Bonaparte, who has conquered most of Europe, is confident this campaign will take 6 weeks. Russia will surrender, accept French dominance, and Napoleon will return to Paris in triumph before winter. 6 months later, the remnants of this magnificent army stagger back across the Russian border, frozen, starving, half mad with cold and hunger. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 40,000 will return as functional soldiers. The rest are dead, captured, deserted, or so broken by cold and starvation that they'll never fight again. It is the single worst military disaster in European history up to that point, and it will destroy Napoleon's empire. This is the story of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the campaign that broke the seemingly invincible Grande Armée through a combination of military strategy, scorched earth tactics, Russian winter, and Napoleon's own fatal overconfidence. This is about hubris, endurance, and the frozen hell that swallowed an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812 was at the height of his power. He controlled France, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, Italy, and Spain. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia in previous wars. His brothers sat on thrones across Europe. His military reputation was unmatched. He was, without exaggeration, the most powerful man in Europe. But his dominance had one major weakness. Russia refused to stay defeated. In 1807, Napoleon had forced Russia to accept the Treaty of Tilsit after defeating them at Friedland. The treaty required Russia to join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade designed to strangle Britain by preventing European nations from trading with it. But by 1810, Russia was openly violating the blockade, trading with Britain through neutral intermediaries. The continental system was failing, and Russia's defiance was emboldening other nations. Napoleon decided that Russia needed to be crushed definitively. He would invade, destroy the Russian armies, occupy Moscow, and force Tsar Alexander I to accept permanent French dominance. Napoleon's plan was based on his previous successful campaigns. Advance rapidly, force the enemy to fight a decisive battle, win that battle through superior tactics and artillery, then dictate peace terms from the enemy's capital. This formula had worked against Austria, Prussia, and Russia itself in previous wars. Napoleon had no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. The army Napoleon assembled for this campaign was staggering in size and international composition. Over 600,000 soldiers, roughly half were French, the rest were from allied or conquered nations: Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Spanish, Swiss, Croats, even Portuguese. This diversity was both a strength and weakness. It gave Napoleon enormous numbers, but language barriers, differing military traditions, and varying levels of commitment created coordination problems. The Grande Armée was organized into multiple corps, each a self-contained army with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The French units were veterans who had fought across Europe. The Allied units varied widely in quality. Polish troops were highly motivated and fought well. German contingents were professional and disciplined, but some Allied units were unreliable conscripts who had been forced into French service. Logistics for this massive army were nightmare complexity. Napoleon needed to supply 600,000 men and approximately 200,000 horses with food, ammunition, clothing, and equipment across hundreds of miles of primitive roads through sparsely populated territory. He assembled enormous supply trains with thousands of wagons, established forward supply depots, and issued detailed logistics plans. But he also expected the army to live off the land, foraging from Russian territory as they advanced. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia near Kaunas in modern Lithuania. The crossing took several days as hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of horses, and thousands of wagons moved across temporary bridges. Russian border guards withdrew without fighting, reporting the invasion to their commanders. The campaign had begun. Napoleon's immediate goal was to destroy the Russian armies before they could retreat into the vast interior. The Russians had two main armies: the First Army under General Barclay de Tolly, with about 120,000 men, and the Second Army under General Bagration, with about 45,000 men. If Napoleon could catch and destroy these armies near the border, the war would be over quickly. But the Russians had different plans. The Russian command faced a dilemma. They couldn't defeat Napoleon's army in direct battle. They were outnumbered, and French tactical superiority was proven, but they couldn't simply surrender either. The solution was controversial: retreat. Draw Napoleon deeper into Russia, stretch his supply lines, avoid major battles, and wait for the Grande Armée to exhaust itself through attrition, desertion, and logistics failures. This strategy was not primarily about winter, though winter would eventually play a role. It was about space and logistics. Russia was vast, with poor roads, sparse population, and limited food supplies even in summer. An army of 600,000 men needed enormous quantities of food and fodder daily. As Napoleon advanced deeper into Russia, his supply lines grew longer, more vulnerable, and less efficient. Meanwhile, the Russians could fall back on their own supply bases and reinforcements. The strategy also involved scorched earth, destroying food, fodder, and supplies that the French might capture. As Russian armies retreated, they burned crops, slaughtered livestock they couldn't take with them, and emptied granaries. This denied Napoleon the ability to live off the land and forced him to rely entirely on his increasingly inadequate supply system. But this strategy was deeply unpopular in Russia. Many generals, particularly Bagration, wanted to fight. They saw retreat as cowardly and dishonorable. Russian public opinion was outraged, believing their armies were fleeing without fighting. Even Tsar Alexander I was uncertain about the strategy, caught between military necessity and political pressure to stand and fight. As Napoleon advanced through Lithuania and Belarus in June and July, the Russians retreated before him. Napoleon repeatedly tried to trap and destroy Russian forces, but they always managed to escape. The Russians fought delaying actions, small battles to slow French advance, but never committed to the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. The Grande Armée's problems began almost immediately. The logistics system started breaking down within weeks of invasion. Supply wagons broke down on primitive roads, horses died from overwork and lack of fodder, food supplies ran short, soldiers resorted to looting, which alienated the local population and turned potential allies into enemies. Desertion began, particularly among non-French units who saw no reason to die for Napoleon's ambitions. Disease also struck hard. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread through the army as sanitation collapsed and contaminated water sources were used. Thousands of soldiers fell sick daily. By August, Napoleon had lost perhaps 100,000 men without fighting a major battle. Dead from disease, exhausted from marching, deserted, or too sick to continue. The Grande Armée was shrinking before it even engaged the main Russian forces. Napoleon grew increasingly frustrated. His entire strategy depended on forcing Russia to fight and winning decisively. But the Russians kept retreating, and Napoleon kept advancing deeper into hostile territory with a weakening army. He reached Vitebsk in late July and briefly considered halting for the year, consolidating his gains and resuming the campaign in 1813. But his pride and his belief that one more push would force the decisive battle drove him forward. In August 1812, political pressure forced the Russians to change commanders. Barclay de Tolly, architect of the retreat strategy, was replaced by General Mikhail Kutuzov, a one-eyed veteran who was popular with the army and the public. Kutuzov understood that retreat was militarily correct, but he also understood that Russia needed a battle to restore national morale. He decided to make a stand. On September 7, 1812, the two armies met at Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow. This was the decisive battle Napoleon had been seeking for 3 months. The Russians occupied a strong defensive position with earthwork fortifications. Kutuzov commanded approximately 120,000 Russian soldiers. Napoleon had about 130,000, but many were sick, exhausted, or demoralized. This was no longer the magnificent army that had crossed the Niemen in June. The Battle of Borodino became the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's strategy was brutal and unimaginative. Frontal assault with massed artillery support. French artillery, over 500 guns, pounded Russian positions. French infantry attacked repeatedly against Russian fortifications. The Russians defended with desperate courage, knowing that if they broke, Moscow lay open. The fighting was horrific. Both sides fed troops into a meat grinder of artillery fire and close combat. The Russians lost the key Bagration-Flesch's fortifications after hours of savage fighting. Bagration himself was mortally wounded. The center of the Russian line held despite repeated French assaults. By evening, the Russians had been pushed back but not broken. They withdrew in good order during the night, having lost approximately 45,000 casualties. French casualties exceeded 35,000. Napoleon had won a tactical victory. He held the battlefield and the Russians had retreated. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. He had destroyed a significant portion of his army without destroying the Russian army. The Grande Armée now numbered perhaps 100,000 effective combat troops, having lost over 500,000 men since June from combat, disease, desertion, and garrison duties in occupied territory. The Russians had lost heavily but could draw on reserves. Napoleon had no reserves left in Russia. Worse, Napoleon had squandered his best chance to destroy the Russian army. At a crucial moment in the battle, his generals had begged him to commit the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve of 20,000 fresh troops, to break the Russian center. Napoleon refused, reportedly saying, "I will not have my guard destroyed. When you are 800 leagues from home, you do not wreck your last reserves." His caution was understandable but costly. The Imperial Guard never engaged, and the chance to destroy Kutuzov's army was lost. After Borodino, the path to Moscow lay open. Napoleon expected that occupying Russia's ancient capital would force Alexander to negotiate. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow with the remnants of his army, expecting to find shelter, supplies, and perhaps Russian emissaries ready to discuss peace terms. Instead, he found a city largely abandoned and about to burn. Moscow in 1812 was Russia's largest city and its historical heart, though St. Petersburg had been the capital for over a century. Napoleon expected that occupying Moscow would have immense psychological impact, forcing Russia to sue for peace as Prussia and Austria had done when Napoleon occupied their capitals. He was wrong. The Russian leadership had made a strategic decision. Moscow would be sacrificed. Governor Fyodor Rostopchin had organized the evacuation of Moscow's population. Nobles fled with their valuables. The middle class abandoned their homes. Even criminals were released from prisons and sent away. By the time Napoleon arrived, roughly 75% of Moscow's population had left, taking or destroying anything useful. The city Napoleon occupied was a shell. Then Moscow began to burn. Fires broke out across the city within hours of French occupation. The fires spread rapidly through Moscow's largely wooden buildings, driven by wind and fed by abandoned stores of goods. For 5 days, Moscow burned. Roughly 3/4 of the city was destroyed. Whether the fires were deliberately set on Russian orders or were accidental results of French looting and the breakdown of order remains debated, but the effect was catastrophic for Napoleon. The Grande Armée, expecting to spend weeks resting in comfortable quarters with abundant supplies, instead found itself camping in the ruins of a burned city. The supplies they had hoped to capture were destroyed. Buildings that might have provided shelter were gutted. Moscow offered almost nothing useful to the French, just ruins and ashes. Napoleon spent 5 weeks in Moscow, from September 14th to October 19th, waiting for Alexander to negotiate. He sent peace proposals. He waited for Russian emissaries. None came. Alexander had decided that no peace with Napoleon was acceptable. Russia would continue fighting regardless of cost. Every day Napoleon spent in Moscow was a day his army grew weaker, while the Russian army grew stronger with reinforcements. The situation was becoming desperate. The Grande Armée was consuming its remaining supplies with no way to replace them. Winter was approaching. The Russian army, reinforced to over 100,000 men, was blocking the route back to friendly territory. Partisan warfare had erupted behind French lines, with Russian irregular forces and peasant militias attacking French supply convoys and isolated detachments. The occupied territories were becoming increasingly hostile and dangerous. Napoleon faced a terrible choice: stay in Moscow through winter with inadequate supplies, advance deeper into Russia chasing an enemy who wouldn't fight, or retreat back through territory already stripped of supplies. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon made his decision: retreat. The retreat began in relatively good order. Napoleon still commanded roughly 100,000 men in Moscow, with another 50,000 or so scattered in garrisons and supply bases between Moscow and the border. But problems emerged immediately. The army was burdened with looted goods that soldiers refused to abandon. The horses were in terrible condition, many too weak to pull supply wagons or artillery. The route back was through territory already devastated by the French advance and Russian scorched earth, offering nothing to forage. Napoleon initially tried to retreat south along a different route than the advance, hoping to find unspoiled territory with food and supplies. But Russian forces blocked this route at Maloyaroslavets in a fierce battle on October 24th. Napoleon was forced back onto the original route of advance, marching through territory already stripped bare and littered with corpses from the summer campaign. The retreat became a nightmare almost immediately. By late October, temperatures were dropping, soldiers were hungry, horses were dying, and discipline was collapsing. The Grande Armée was transforming from a military force into a starving mob focused solely on survival. The first snow fell in early November. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers, wearing summer uniforms, many without proper boots, began suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. Each night, thousands of soldiers fell behind the main column, too exhausted or sick to continue. Most of these stragglers died during the night from cold, or were killed by Russian partisans and peasants who showed no mercy to isolated Frenchmen. Horses died by the thousands, collapsing from starvation, exhaustion, and cold. As horses died, supply wagons had to be abandoned. Then artillery pieces had to be abandoned, robbing the army of its most powerful weapons. Without wagons and horses, wounded soldiers had to be left behind. The retreat became a trail of abandoned equipment, frozen corpses, and dying men begging for help that never came. Discipline disintegrated. Units broke apart as soldiers focused on individual survival rather than military cohesion. Officers lost control of their men. Looting became universal, with soldiers fighting each other over scraps of food or articles of warm clothing. The army that had been Europe's finest military force was reduced to a desperate mob. Russian forces harassed the retreat constantly. Cossack cavalry raided the flanks of the French columns, picking off stragglers and attacking supply trains. Russian regular forces blocked river crossings and attacked the rear guard. Partisans ambushed isolated detachments. The French were under constant attack, but too weak and disorganized to respond effectively. The catastrophe reached its peak at the Berezina River in late November. Napoleon's engineers managed to construct 2 temporary bridges across the partially frozen river under Russian artillery fire. For 3 days, the remnants of the Grande Armée struggled to cross while Russian forces attacked. Thousands drowned when ice floes destroyed parts of the bridges. Thousands more were killed by Russian artillery. Those who crossed did so by walking over the bodies of those who had fallen before them. The Berezina crossing destroyed what remained of the Grande Armée as an organized military force. By early December, Napoleon commanded perhaps 20,000 soldiers still capable of fighting, along with another 20,000 stragglers who were military ineffective. Roughly 400,000 men had been lost in Russia, dead, captured, deserted, or so broken they could no longer function as soldiers. On December 5, 1812, Napoleon made a controversial decision. He would abandon the army and rush back to Paris. He claimed he needed to organize France's defenses against the inevitable coalition that would form to attack him. He left Marshal Murat in command of what remained of the army and departed with a small escort. Napoleon's departure devastated morale. The soldiers saw it as abandonment, their emperor fleeing to safety while leaving them to die in Russia. But practically, Napoleon's presence or absence made little difference at this point. The Grande Armée was doomed regardless of who commanded it. The surviving remnants of the Grande Armée staggered across the Niemen River back into Prussian territory in mid-December 1812. They were unrecognizable as the magnificent force that had crossed in June. Fewer than 40,000 soldiers crossed as organized military units. Perhaps another 60,000 stragglers would eventually make it back over subsequent weeks, though many were so broken by their experiences that they were militarily useless. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, over 500,000 were casualties, approximately 300,000 dead, 100,000 captured, and 100,000 deserted. The largest army ever assembled in European history had been destroyed in 6 months without losing a single decisive battle. The Russian campaign cost Napoleon the veterans who had won his previous victories, the horses that had pulled his artillery, the prestige that had kept his enemies cowed. The Russian losses were also catastrophic. Russia lost perhaps 200,000 soldiers killed in combat or dead from disease, another 100,000 wounded or captured. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from war-related causes, starvation, exposure, disease, or partisan warfare violence. Moscow was destroyed. Vast territories were devastated. The economic cost was enormous, but Russia had won, and winning justified the sacrifice. The military lessons of the campaign were clear but often misunderstood. The popular narrative emphasizes General Winter and suggests that cold alone defeated Napoleon. This is simplistic. Winter certainly contributed to the catastrophe, but the Grande Armée was already broken before winter set in. Napoleon had lost 300,000 men by September, most from disease, desertion, and logistics failures. The campaign failed because of strategic retreat, scorched earth, overextended supply lines, disease, and partisan warfare, with winter delivering the final blow to an already defeated army. The political consequences of Napoleon's defeat in Russia were immediate and catastrophic for his empire. Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, previously forced allies of France, now joined Russia in a new coalition against Napoleon. German states that had provided troops for the Russian campaign now switched sides. By 1813, Napoleon faced a united Europe. Though he would fight brilliantly in the 1813 campaign, winning several battles, he could not replace the veterans lost in Russia. In 1814, Paris fell to Allied armies, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The Russian campaign of 1812 was Napoleon's greatest mistake, the decision that ultimately cost him his empire. But why did he make this catastrophic error? Napoleon was a military genius who had won dozens of battles and conquered most of Europe. How did such a brilliant commander walk into disaster? The answer is hubris, combined with strategic blindness and misunderstanding of the type of war he was fighting. Napoleon approached the Russian campaign using the template that had worked in previous wars: rapid advance, decisive battle, occupation of the enemy capital, then dictated peace. This formula had worked against Austria, Prussia, and even Russia in previous campaigns. Napoleon assumed it would work again. But Russia was different in crucial ways. First, Russian space was vast. Armies could retreat for hundreds of miles without losing critical territory. Occupying Moscow didn't cripple Russia the way occupying Vienna crippled Austria, or Berlin crippled Prussia. Second, Russian society was different. The Tsar had absolute authority and didn't face the domestic political pressures that forced other European monarchs to make peace after losing battles. Alexander could continue fighting regardless of military setbacks. Third, Russian economy was less developed and less dependent on international trade, making economic blockade less effective. Napoleon also fundamentally misunderstood logistics in Russia. He planned for his army to live partially off the land, as French armies had done in wealthier parts of Europe. But Russia's agricultural productivity was lower, its population sparser, and its infrastructure more primitive. The territory couldn't support 600,000 men even without scorched earth tactics. Napoleon's logistics plan was inadequate from the start. Finally, Napoleon made tactical and operational errors throughout the campaign. He divided his forces, sending large detachments on secondary missions that weakened his main army without achieving significant results. He failed to trap and destroy Russian armies when opportunities arose. He wasted time at Moscow, waiting for peace negotiations that were never going to happen. He began the retreat too late, giving winter time to catch his army. And he refused to commit his reserves at Borodino, missing his best chance to destroy the Russian army. The human cost of Napoleon's error was staggering. Over 600,000 soldiers entered Russia. Fewer than 100,000 returned, and many of those were permanently broken by their experiences. The majority were dead, their bodies scattered across Russia or dumped in mass graves. Many had died horrible deaths, freezing to death in snowbanks, starving in ruins, killed by partisans, drowned in rivers, or succumbing to disease in field hospitals. Those who survived carried trauma that would haunt them for life. The suffering wasn't limited to soldiers. Russian civilians paid an enormous price. Scorched earth tactics destroyed their harvests and livestock. Partisan warfare turned their communities into battlegrounds. Retreating and advancing armies requisitioned or stole their food, leaving them to starve. The winter of 1812 to 1813 saw widespread famine in Western Russia as the devastation of war combined with crop failures. The campaign also had profound impacts on military thinking. The lessons of the Russian campaign influenced military planning for decades. Future armies would be more cautious about invading Russia's vast spaces. The importance of logistics and supply would be emphasized. The dangers of overextension would be taught in military academies. Hitler would largely ignore these lessons in 1941, launching an invasion of Russia that paralleled Napoleon's in many ways and ended in similar catastrophe. The 1812 campaign entered Russian national mythology as the Patriotic War, a moment when the Russian people, from nobles to peasants, united to defend the motherland against foreign invasion. This narrative, while somewhat simplified, contained truth. Russians had made enormous sacrifices, endured terrible suffering, and ultimately won against seemingly impossible odds. The victory demonstrated Russian resilience, strengthened Russian national identity, and established Russia as a major European power.